But before I move to the second one, I should say this. I recognize that many of you have heard of this concept before, and you may actually have some experience in learning about it. And at the same time, it may be a new concept for many others. So, what I want to do is make sure that we're all working from the same standpoint in terms of baseline knowledge and information. The second objective is going to be focused on understanding how racial microaggressions impact student success, particularly for minoritized students. Specifically, we'll talk about how racial microaggressions impact student engagement, sense of belonging, self-efficacy, and other variables that have been linked by researchers to student success. And then finally, and perhaps the most important objective, is we're going to come up with some strategies to address racial microaggressions. One thing I'm going to ask everyone to do is to mute your microphones. During the workshop, if comes a time where you need to speak or ask a question or we're engaged in dialogue, then of course I invite you to unmute at that time. But if we just mute for the duration of the workshop, it'll help us cut down on any background noise. Okay, so before we get directly into racial microaggressions, we're going to first talk about implicit bias. And it's important to talk about implicit bias because implicit bias are actually the root of microaggressions. So what we have here are three somewhat similar but different definitions of implicit bias. Now, I'm not going to read each of them to you, but I do want to highlight some cross-cutting themes in each of these definitions. The first is that implicit bias is reflected in our unconscious thoughts and assumptions that are derived from our past experiences, and we're going to kind of talk about what some of those experiences might be, the ones that tend to be most salient in this regard. Second, even though we're not aware of our implicit biases, they motivate our thoughts and they motivate our actions. And then the last point is that we're all susceptible to the effects of implicit bias. So understanding this, I think it's important that we talk about the conditions under which implicit bias is most likely to be activated. And the research tells us that implicit bias is the result of system one thinking. So system one thinking, you see it presented here to the left of the slide, is characterized by reasoning and sense making that occurs unconsciously. It's thinking that is implicit and operating slightly below our level of awareness. So we're not always aware of what we're thinking when we're engaged in system one thinking. It kind of just happens. And that it is automated and occurs with very little intentional effort. Now, in contrast, system two thinking is characterized by reasoning that is very conscious and very explicit, in that we're very aware of what we're thinking and the actions that motivate what we're thinking. And the metaphor that I often find helpful in comparing system one and system two thinking is the metaphor of driving a stick shift car. So for those of you who've driven a stick shift in the past, you know that when you're learning how to drive one, you have to exert quite a bit of effort in coordinating when and how to shift from one speed to the next, while also managing the clutch, managing the brake, and following the rules of the road, right? And it takes quite a bit of concentration, at least it did for me as I was learning. And then eventually, as we become more comfortable with how the vehicle operates and the rules of the road, this process becomes like second nature. And we get to the point where we're able to manage it without giving it much thought. And we can even start to multitask while doing it, right? So, we see some people shaving and brushing their teeth and doing their hair and stuff while they're actually driving the car, right? And I think that exemplifies the difference between system one and system two thinking. So system one thinking is kind of like what, the state that we're in terms of, the cognitive state that we're in when we're learning how to drive the stick shift. And system two is where we are once we've mastered it and we're comfortable. The other way around. System one is once we've mastered it and we're comfortable with it. System two is where we're at cognitively when we're learning how to drive a stick shift. The research also tells us this, and this is important. System one thinking and, by default, implicit bias is most likely to be activated when the following three conditions are present. when we're in situations that involve ambiguous or incomplete information, so we're in a situation we don't have a lot of information, or the information that we have is unclear, or the information that we have is just confusing in some respects, right? Second, situation in which time is constrained. So we don't have a lot of information, or the information we have is not very clear, and we have to make decisions in a short amount of time. And then lastly, times when cognitive control is compromised, such as when experiencing stress or insufficient sleep. So if we think about the last 2 months, right? We think about the context of COVID-19, or when we think about the context at the beginning of the semester, when we have a lot of new students coming to campus, we have a lot of new faculty and staff coming to campus also around that time. And you know, there's a lot of people, we don't know a lot about students. The students who we're necessarily working with, we may not know a lot about them. We have to kind of help them and serve them in a pretty short amount of time. They can be pressured to get it done quickly. And you know, maybe we're tired, maybe we're stressed out. And so we got to recognize that, you know, the conditions that are most stressful are the conditions in which we're most likely to default to system one thinking. And as a result, our implicit bias is activated. And what you're going to learn shortly is that that's when racial microaggressions are most likely to occur. So we also have to be mindful of this. There are several factors that influence our thoughts and feelings when our implicit bias is most present. So some that you see represented here, the information we consume from the media, whether it be on television or social media, is one example. You know, when we think about nonverbal cues of others, nonverbal behaviors of others, I should say. And believe it or not, there've been quite a few studies that have been, that look to understand implicit bias. And what many of these studies have done is looked at like the context of preschools, and they've looked specifically at how preschool children react to the nonverbal behavior of adults that are enacted towards other children, right? So in other words, they're looking at how children learn vicariously about other children by observing what adults do in response to those children. And so they find that in many ways, preschool children pick up a lot of the attitudes and behaviors of just by observing the way adults treat other children. So, you know, there's a lot more to it than that, but that's a sort of a quick snapshot of what this research is conducted and concluded. We also have attitudes of friends and family members. So I often think about the things that I may have overheard from like adult friends and family members over the years about certain groups of people, and how that may have influenced the way I think and feel about different groups of people. Sometimes we have interactions, particularly early interactions that we have with different groups of people that may drive our implicit bias. Observation of social roles. One of the most salient examples of this factor is Black men. And Black men in particular are routinely presented in the media as athletes. And rarely are Black men presented as doctors, lawyers, corporate executives, professors. And so, you know, many people assume that Black men who are successful had to achieve their success in the context of sport. And then related to this last point, perception of social values. The values that are placed upon certain identities affect the implicit assumptions that we make about these identities. We all know some identities are privileged, and there are other identities that tend to be marginalized, and it has some influence over how we think and feel about people who embody those identities. So with, you know, those ideas and concepts related to implicit bias as a backdrop, I want to start to move our conversation into the conversation about microaggressions. Dr. Gerald Wing Su is widely known as the leading scholar on racial microaggressions. And he describes them as brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial slights and insults towards people of color. So he also says this, racial microaggressions are pervasive in the sense that people of color and other minority groups experience them on almost a daily basis. They can be expressed both verbally and they can be expressed verbally, such as a subtle slight or a put down. Like, for example, when someone says, "Oh my God, that's so ghetto," right? As a way to sort of talk about or degrade something. They can also be expressed non-verbally. Non-verbally in the way that someone looks at a person of color or responds non-verbally to their actual physical presence, as examples. And we're going to talk more about these as we get more into the web, deeper into the content. Here's the key point. Regardless of how they are expressed, racial microaggressions have a way of invalidating the experiences and intellectual capabilities of people of color. We're going to talk about that very shortly. And because racial microaggressions are often expressed subtly, it is often difficult to know what someone really thinks or feels when we're on the receiving end of one. So for example, let's say a professor says to a student who responds to a question that the professor poses during class, "Wow, good answer. I really did not expect you to know that." The student may wonder, why was the professor surprised that I knew the answer, and may actually drive herself crazy trying to figure out what the professor thinks of her and her intellectual capabilities. This sense making can be exhausting, and it can take up a lot of emotional time and energy. And because of this last point, some researchers often say that racial microaggressions can be more psychologically damaging than overt acts of racism. Because with overt acts of racism, there's no need to second guess or ask how the person feels about you. Whereas with microaggressions, you're not always certain, you don't always know. So here's what I'd like you to do for about a half a minute. Think about a time when you either observed someone being microaggressed or when you've actually experienced a microaggression. How did it make you feel? How did you respond? So just take about 30 seconds to think about that question. So usually when I ask this question, and when I'm sort of doing this for a live audience, people can usually recall the times in which they observed or experienced a microaggression. They can usually recall it fairly easy, but there could be a huge range of responses depending on the audience. And the feelings that come up most often are anger, confusion, and embarrassment. Those are probably the three things that I hear most often when folks are kind of describing how they felt in these situations. And by and large, most people are usually pretty uncomfortable with what they either experienced or what they observed. And regarding responses, I often hear this as well. A lot of people say they don't really know what to say or how to respond because racial microaggressions are usually subtly expressed, and the person who hears them is not always certain where the person is coming from. So people also say they don't know how to respond when the person who expressed a racial microaggression is in a position of power or influence, right? So we can think about a professor, we can think about a supervisor. And obviously this can be very understandable because the fear of retaliation can be a real concern for a lot of people. And because of the uncertainty that can surround racial microaggressions and the fear of retaliation, it can be really difficult to address them when they occur. Another point here is that most people, particularly educators, see themselves as good people who care about the well-being of others. They can often respond with defensiveness when they're accused of microaggression someone. There's also a tendency to see oneself as a victim and blame the person who's been microaggressed as actually offending them, right? So I microaggress someone, for example, me being an educator who studies equity and who teaches courses on equity and diversity, I microaggress someone. Someone says, "Hey, Dr. Harris, I really didn't appreciate the statement you made because this is how it made me feel and this is how it came across." Well, then instead of me sort of saying, first of all, taking the time to listen and understand where the person is coming from, my knee-jerk reaction can be, oh my God, what are you talking about? You got it all wrong. You're misunderstanding me. You're misinterpreting what I'm saying. Actually, I'm offended that you would even think that I would say something or think something like that. That often tends to be, that's a fairly common response, which again makes it really difficult to address racial microaggressions. But here's what we have to understand. Almost every single one of us who's tuned in here, myself included, has likely microaggressed someone and been on the receiving end of a microaggression. And so when we are able to accept this and understand that in many ways this is just part of interacting in a social world, then perhaps it's a little bit easier to accept accountability for our microaggression. And we'll talk more about strategies towards the end of this presentation. Okay, so it's also important to recognize this. Racial microaggressions can be expressed in many different ways. We know they can be expressed both verbally and non-verbally. We've already talked about that a little bit, but they can also be environmental. So when we think about a racist image or a racist meme, that would be an example of an environmental microaggression. Confederate flag might be something else that folks experience as racially microaggressive. They can be expressed in public, like in the presence of a large group of people, say 3 or more people, or even in a Zoom meeting, here where we have about 30 people tuned in. That would be an example of a public space. And they can be expressed in private, such as between 2 people. The way that a racial microaggression is expressed often has some influence on the actions that we take to address them. So to understand the influence of racial microaggressions, you have to really get a sense of what the underlying message is communicating, right? So there's what someone says, Frank, you're so articulate, and then there's what's really being communicated, right? Wow, Frank, you're a lot more articulate than I would have expected you to be, given your identity and who you are, right? So there's always this underlying message that we have to be mindful of when we're addressing microaggressions. We also know this, for people of color, the messages that are communicated by way of racial microaggressions are fairly consistent. They're all here. I shouldn't say all of them, but quite a few of them, about a dozen or so, are presented here on the screen. We can take a look at what some of them are. And then we're going to talk about the most common types of racial microaggressions that are experienced by people of color in education. And in many ways, these are the underlying messages that are communicated by those statements. So we also have to recognize this. There are different types of microaggressions. In fact, researchers have identified that racial microaggressions fall into 3 different categories. The first is micro insults, which you see presented on the left of your screen. And these offend someone on the basis of their identity or culture. There's also micro invalidations, which are presented on the right of the screen. And what micro invalidations do is they belittle or disregard someone's experiences. And then we have micro assaults, which are not presented on the screen. And these are more consistent with overt acts of racism, like expressing a racial slur towards someone. So unlike micro insults and unlike micro invalidations, micro assaults are not subtle at all. They're actually very intentional and very transparent. So we won't spend a whole lot of time discussing micro assaults. We're going to focus our time on micro insults and micro invalidations. And here are there's about 7 or 8 of these that we'll focus on specifically. Again, these being the ones that are the most commonly experienced amongst people of color in educational contexts. So let's talk about the first one, a description of intelligence. And this microaggression occurs when we devalue or disregard someone's intellectual capabilities. Some examples of statements that are expressed often in this regard, oh, you're so articulate, or wow, you wrote this? Like, did you actually write this? You speak better, or you write better than I would have expected. It's kind of the underlying message there. This is a calculus class, so you sure you're in the right place. I'm going to actually come back to this statement a few slides from now, but just make note of it for now. We've had students talk about being the last one picked for group projects because other students would assume that they don't know as much as they do. We hear this often from students who speak with an accent, and the assumption is that, well, they're English language learners, so they're not that smart or not as proficient with English, so we don't want to have them partake in our group. We already spoke about this fourth one. There have been times when I've answered a question and I get a response like, wow, I didn't expect you to know that. And this last one, you are so good at math. I bet it's because you're Asian, right? Now, I want to highlight this one here for a couple of reasons. First, there's this phenomenon called the model minority myth that Asian Americans often experience, is when everyone assumes that, Asian Americans are a model minority. They've successfully assimilated into the American context. Therefore, they don't have any challenges. Things are very easy for them. They don't have any educational challenges, and therefore there's no need for any type of intervention or support on behalf of these students. And what's problematic about the model minority myth is that, first of all, it's not a reality, right? We know that Asian Americans experience many challenges in educational contexts. And the second reason why I wanted to highlight this particular one is because when we assume that, for example, sometimes we can assume that if we have, like, if we're complimenting someone, right, or the perception that we have of a person is positive, therefore it's not a microaggression. Well, even if it's a positive, a seemingly positive statement, it can still be a microaggression and still be perceived as a microaggression. Because what if I'm actually an Asian American, and what if I'm really not good at math, right? How is that going to impact my help seeking? How is that going to impact my self-efficacy if I don't live up to the stereotype of, being someone who's good at math, right? It's going to have some detrimental effects, on how well I do, and if I'm willing to seek help if I need support. The next one is an assumption of criminality. And this one occurs when we view a person of color as being dangerous, a thug, or someone who is likely to commit a crime based on their identity. So some examples here, right? I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be racist, but people of color come from neighborhoods with lots of crime. It's just a fact. Just watch the news. Now, we also know this. Once you preface a statement with, I'm not trying to be racist, then usually whatever you say after that is probably something that's racist, right? So that should kind of be a red flag, for all of us. Next one, I have to be honest. When I'm alone at night, there are times when I worry about being assaulted by a Black and Latino male. It's not that I'm racist. I just have a gut feeling that tells me that I need to protect myself, right? And so the question would be, well, what is it about Black and Latino men that give you that gut feeling that you need to protect yourself, that you don't get when you're approached or interacting with people who don't have these same identities? Next one, I know all Muslims weren't responsible for 9/11, but whenever I hear about Ramadan, right now we're in the season of Ramadan, it does remind me of what happened. I just can't help it again, right? The assumption that, people of Muslim descent who identify as Muslim are somehow linked to terrorism. And then the last one, Latinx students are more likely to plagiarize on their papers than others. It's not that they aren't smart, they just don't understand the language. Now, this one could also be considered an assumption of an description of intelligence, the microaggression we just discussed. But I put it here because this whole notion of plagiarism and students cheating and certain groups of students being more likely to cheat than other groups is in many ways aligned with this assumption of criminality. Okay, our next one, second-class citizen, occurs when a white person is given preferential treatment over a person of color. This occurs when we render people of color as unimportant or invisible in spaces where whites are present. So, a faculty member calling on a white student several times while disregarding students of color who raise their hands in class, and overlooking a student of color at a student services counter to attend to a white student are both examples of this. Next one, pathologizing culture. This is one that's, again, that's very present in educational settings, occurs when people make derogatory statements about communities of color or assume that people of color come from communities that are not value added to educational content. So when we hear people say things like those students, right? Those Black and brown students is the underlying message here. Don't care about education. They're lazy. They really aren't here to learn. They're just here for the financial aid. This next one, I guess it would be the fifth one, is a statement that actually was expressed by our Surgeon General, the Surgeon General of the United States, who, by the way, is an African-American man, who said this: if Blacks made healthier choices about what they eat and stopped drinking and smoking, then so many of them wouldn't be dying from COVID-19, right? Again, pathologizing Black cultures. And assuming that Blacks are more prone to drink and eat unhealthy and to smoke than other races and ethnicities. This last one, going back to education, if they would stop spending their stipend checks on rims and sneakers, then they wouldn't be so hungry and homeless, right? Talking about how students, particularly students of color, utilize their financial aid resources. Next one, different norming. This occurs when someone assumes they have the authority to negatively categorize or uncategorize a person of color. Now, this one occurs when a person of color does not neatly conform to the racist stereotypes and assumptions that someone has brought into. So for example, when a person of color is intelligent, accomplished, or behaves in ways that have been socially coded as acceptable. So, some examples, Frank, when I was talking about those Blacks, I really wasn't talking about you, right? Or I don't really think of you as Asian. You're not like the rest of them. You're different. You work hard. Or why can't all minorities be like you? Would be examples of different norming. Athletic boundedness. The assumption that people of color, particularly men of color, are athletes. I want to stress this first and foremost. There's absolutely nothing wrong with being an athlete. But where this becomes problematic is the stereotype of athletes as being jocks who are only allowed into college because of their athletic abilities and not because of their intellectual abilities, or even both for that matter. And then we also know this: there have been many athletes who've excelled both in sports and in academics, but this trend is often overlooked or disregarded when it comes to athletes of color. And we see some examples of statements here that align with this microaggression. Okay, I think we have three more. Next one, outsider of campus, on campus, assuming a person of color does not belong in academic spaces. So this microaggression actually is closely aligned with one that we already discussed, with the second-class citizen one. And this one occurs when one assumes that a person of color does not belong in an academic space, such as a library or in an advanced math class, as examples. Regarding the latter, one time we were doing some focus groups at a college, and we had a Black male student we interviewed who shared that he walked into a calculus class, and he walked in a few minutes late. It was the first day of the semester. He was new to the campus, and he walked into the class, and the professor said to him, "This is a calculus class. Are you sure you're in the right place?" Now, the professor probably had good intentions and was actually probably really trying to help the student. But the assumption that he didn't belong there, presumably because of his identity, is what made this interaction problematic for the student. And we often hear many examples of things like this occurring. Next one is colorblindness. Now, this one occurs when a person pretends not to see color. Now, I admit this one can be very, very tricky, and it can be confusing because we're often taught that it's rude or impolite to see someone based on their race. Now, I would say this: it's not rude to recognize that someone's race. So, an example, it's not rude to recognize that I'm Black, I think it's pretty apparent. And I would also say this: most people of color would say that their race is actually a salient aspect of who they are and something that they're actually proud of. And so the problem occurs when we make negative judgments, characterizations, and we treat people poorly based on their race, right? So I would often say it's not that race is a problem, it's racial prejudice and racism is actually what the root of the problem is. So some examples we see here, when I see you, I don't see color. America is a melting pot. There's only one race, the human race, and race is only as important as we make it, are examples there. Okay, here's our last one. The myth of meritocracy. So this one occurs when we assume that race plays little or no role in life opportunities and life success. So some examples here: if minorities would just work harder, they can be just as successful as whites and Asians, right? And this is, again, assuming that in some ways that whites and Asians don't have challenges and don't need support as well, right? That's kind of a secondary issue there. Another example: when my great grandparents immigrated from Europe, no one gave them anything. They were poor too, but they worked hard to buy a home and start a business. If they can do it, anybody can do it, right? Or examples of both of these. Okay, so we're going to transition into some scenarios that I prepared that's going to help us kind of, address and work with some of these concepts. But at this time, I would like to invite any questions, thoughts, or reactions that may be present. And you can type them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask.
I have a question.
Yes.
Why is this important for colleges and those who work for colleges to understand?
Yeah, good question. So there's a few reasons. We do quite a bit of research at SEAL. We do both qualitative and quantitative research. And our research focuses on issues related to equity and student success in community colleges primarily. And in all of the research that we conduct, one of the findings that is consistent is that students of color experience campuses in ways that can be described as racially hostile, right? They talk about issues related to racial battle fatigue. They talk about experiencing microaggressions, and they often say that these are, among the top challenges that they experience. That it makes it difficult for them to connect with faculty members. It makes it difficult for them to ask for help when they need it. It makes it difficult for them to establish community and establish relationships with their classmates. And so we as educators, whether we're working with students in the classroom or outside of the classroom, and in student services, for example, we have a responsibility to recognize the impact on student success first and foremost, but also we have to recognize that we have the potential to microaggress and that we can be responsible to contributing to a hostile climate for students. And I would say for those reasons, we have some responsibility to learn and figure out what it is that we can do to be better at what we do. And understanding racial microaggressions is a part of that.
Thanks.
Yeah, good question. Any others? Okay, let's work through, I prepared 3 scenarios. Let's work through some of the scenarios, and then we'll have some time at the end for any more Q&A as it comes up. So here's what I'm going to ask you to do. I want you to identify the type of microaggression that you see present in each of these scenarios. Keep this in mind, however. The lines that divide one type of microaggression for another, so for example, second-class citizen as opposed to outsider on campus, there could be a lot of gray in between that. So if you see more than one, go ahead and sort of identify what it is you see. For each one, we're going to talk about each and kind of unpack what we see. Okay, here's our first one. I had specifically chosen a class with three of my friends that were barely starting college. We all are Mexican and we all look stereotypical. You would just think bad things about us when you see us. And we're all sitting there in the corner of the classroom. And one of the first things the student says to us is, quote, "No, there are cameras in here and everything, so don't try to bring any weed or knives or anything like that," unquote. You said it kind of like a joke. I laughed, but I really didn't think it was funny. What do you see here in terms of microaggressions? Which ones are most apparent to you? And you can type them in the chat. Okay, assumption of criminality. I see. Any others? Second-class citizen, okay. Okay, here's sort of the two big ones that I see. First, assumption of criminality is probably, you know, the most obvious one there, because the person who microaggresses assumes that these students are likely to be engaged in deviant behavior based on, you know, what they look like. That behavior being carrying weapons and having drugs in their possession. The second one, though, is we could easily make a case for pathologizing culture based on the assumption that Latino men come from high crime communities and are therefore likely to be engaged in a type of behavior that would warrant surveillance. I also see second-class citizen and outsider on campus. Again, both of those sort of talk about how people of color don't belong in academic spaces. I can see why, you know, we could easily make a case for both of those. Okay, let's do one more. Let's do two more, actually. Here's our second one. Frank is an African-American student in his early 50s and is a veteran who has recently returned to college. He went to the bookstore to purchase books and supplies. After standing in line for a few minutes, he was the next customer in line. The clerk looked past him and asked the student behind Frank, "May I help you?" Frank said, "Excuse me, sir, I was next in line." The clerk responded by saying, "I'm sorry, sir, I didn't realize you were standing here for a purchase. I will get to you next." Unhappy with the situation, Frank walked to the counter and said, "I'm sorry, sir, but I waited in line like everybody else. I need to be served now." The clerk replied, "Sir, you need to calm down or I will be forced to call campus police." Which ones do you see represented here? And go ahead and type them in the group chat. Outsider on campus. Any others? Second-class citizen, okay. Different norming, maybe, okay. Second-class citizen. All right, second-class citizen looks like that's the one that's leading the race. Okay, here's what I see. Assumption of criminality and second-class citizen. So the most obvious one is the second-class citizen when he was overlooked by the clerk to tend to another customer. And here's what's interesting about this one. The fact that the clerk said that he didn't think Frank was there for a purchase actually confirms the invisibility that often accompanies this microaggression. Here's the second piece of this. Once Frank began to passionately advocate for himself, the clerk became fearful and threatened to call campus police. Now, when police are called on people of color, when no crime or offense has been committed, it underscores the assumption of criminality microaggression. People often justify this by saying, well, I wanted to call the police before the situation got out of control. And the assumption that a person needs to be controlled and the fear that he would get out of control reinforces this point. There's a socialized and inherent fear of people of color, especially men of color in educational context. All right, here's our last one. I was serving on the search committee for a position at my college. There has been a big focus on hiring more faculty staff of color so we can be more reflective of our student body. Of course, we got lots of applicants, so it was a pretty competitive search. And it's hard to run a search on Zoom. There were some folks who on the committee who expressed the importance of getting a quote quality unquote candidate and not making a decision on the basis of race. Several of us on the committee were immediately triggered by this and asked if they were saying we couldn't get a quality candidate who was also a person of color. One committee member responded with, "No, I'm not saying that, but I do think it's important that white candidates have a fair chance too." Then someone else suggested that we modify the search process to make sure there would be no bias. Okay, which one do you see represented here? Oops, I gave you the answer, never mind. So myth of meritocracy is the most glaring one here. Because some committee members assume that being intentional in hiring a person of color meant that quality could be compromised. The committee member who spoke up actually did a great job, in my opinion, of kind of redirecting and addressing this issue by asking, folks to clarify their position on candidates of color and quality. If I were to take this discussion further, I would have probably said, hey, remember we have other outstanding colleagues, some of whom are on this committee that are also people of color, and hiring them was by no means a sacrifice of quality. And then, I would talk about how, it could be perceived as insulting and inherently racist to suggest that the search process be modified so that a person of color would not be favored, given the college's longstanding history of using regular search processes that resulted in the hiring of disproportionately more white faculty and staff. Okay, questions, thoughts, reactions before we get into strategy?
So my next question was, how does this tie into culturally relevant teaching? Well,
we know this about culturally relevant, I usually say culturally relevant and affirming teaching. We know that when students of color are exposed to a curriculum that affirms their lived experiences, that addresses issues that are relevant to their lives and experiences, that reflect their identities in the curriculum, right? So when we think about learning about people of color who made contributions to whatever they're studying, that it increases their self-efficacy, it increases their intrinsic interest, they do better in these types of courses, and courses that do this, coursework that does this. But we also know that when we think about the ways in which educators are trained, most of us are not trained in how to, prepare and deliver culturally responsive pedagogy. Mm-hmm. We actually see more of it. We see more of it in the K-12 context. So I would say more K-12 teachers are trained to do it than we see, in community college and university. And so there can be, if you're doing a search and you're intentionally trying to identify folks who can deliver a culturally relevant and culturally responsive curriculum, it can be challenging to do. And so part of how you have to do it is to be intentional about what you're looking for. We're looking for people who have some experience in being able to deliver, prepare and deliver culturally responsive teaching and learning experiences to students. When that happens, search committees can get contentious on search committee because some people might see them as favoring people of color in these processes. We also know this, that when it comes to searches, in many ways, we tend to look for people who look for us and who share our identities, who share our values. And that's why sometimes these searches can be deeply personal, because we tend to look for people who in many ways mirror ourselves. So unless we're intentional about what we're looking for, and we're intentional about making sure we're not just trying to reproduce other versions of ourselves in these searches, then we tend to kind of get other versions of ourselves. And that can be challenging as well. And then when you think about COVID-19 and how a lot of this is taking place via Zoom and remotely, it could be even more challenging. And so I think it's just things that we have to recognize and be intentional about addressing.
Thanks.
Yep. Okay, let's do this. Let's talk about some things that we can effectively respond to microaggressions. And to do so, I want to introduce you to a framework that my colleague, Dr. J. Luke Wood, some of you may know him, but he and I developed this strategy a couple years ago as a way to respond to microaggressions. Long story short, a college asked us to help them come and do some training. We looked at the literature on how to respond to microaggressions. Most of what we saw didn't seem to be very good. We weren't satisfied with it. And so we decided we needed to develop something that we thought would be more effective. And this is what we came up with. We call it the Raven. And we call it the Raven because it's a 5-step process. Each step addresses each letter of the Raven addresses a specific step. I do want to mention this. It's, again, remember, microaggressions can be expressed in a lot of different ways. The Raven works best in addressing microaggressions that are, verbal or in text. Either someone says or someone writes something, in public, meaning there's other people present, and in addressing images that are derogatory or exclusionary as well. Okay, so let's talk about the first step. The first step is to redirect the conversation. You got to intervene, you can interrupt, you can pull the person aside, do something else that stops further damage from occurring, right? So if you think about our last scenario, when someone on the committee said, hey, wait, I think we need to stop and think about this and talk about this, are we suggesting that we can't get a quality applicant if we're intentional about making sure that we're addressing disparities, racial and ethnic disparities? That's an example of how we can intervene and redirect the conversation, right? That we got to stop it from, stop the ball from rolling down the mountain, so to speak. Once we do that, we need to ask probing questions. So here's why this is important. We want to get the person to think, pause, and reflect, and to think critically about what they said. Because you may remember when we started this workshop, we have to recognize that microaggressions are rooted in our implicit bias. So sometimes we're not even aware, we microaggress, we say something that's microaggression, we're not often aware that that's what we're doing. And so this is an opportunity for folks to stop and think and say, wow, wait a minute, I did kind of suggest that, if we're looking for quality, that we're not, if we're looking for a person of color, then we're sacrificing quality. And that's not what I intended, but it did come across that way. And there's another point here that why this step is important. You want to give the person a chance to clarify what they may have said. Sometimes we may misunderstand or misinterpret something that we've heard, and this step provides an opportunity to see clarity. All right, third step is we need to engage in a clarification of values. We need to remind the person what they said or the way they've treated someone is not appropriate and not aligned with the values of our classroom, our community, our institution, our workplace, whatever it may be, right? Some things we could say, in this department, we worked hard to create a space that's safe and welcoming for all students. So when you treat a student this way, or when you say something microaggressive to the student, it's in direct conflict with what we value within the space. The next step is to express empathy. Now, this is really important because oftentimes we may assume that the person who's the target of the microaggression is the only person that's actually harmed by it, when in fact, those who observe it or those who overhear it are also harmed. And so this step is important because we need to personalize it a little bit. We need to share our feelings and we need to be transparent. When I hear you say something like that, this is how it makes me feel, right? Or when you make a statement like that, people may assume that this is what you mean or this is what you're saying, right? So it's important to empathize and emphasize how you're feeling. And this last step is we always want to end the conversation with some constructive feedback. We want to give the person some guidance about how they should act the next time they find themselves in a similar situation. Now, we might give them something that they can read, right? So, we might say, hey, you should check out this webinar, or you should take a look at this, right? Give them something that can help further their understanding and get a better sense of why what they said or what they've done might not be appropriate. Now, keep this in mind. You don't have to follow these steps exactly as they're laid out. So the Raven is really more of a heuristic framework. It's really more so about guiding your thinking and guiding your action more so than it is about following a concrete process. So, for example, you might engage in values clarification after you empathize your own thoughts and feelings. Or you might make one statement that kind of accomplishes both things simultaneously. It really doesn't matter what you do first or so forth. The key is that you need to be mindful about how you're going to respond and have a set of objectives that you want to achieve in doing so. So I'm going to offer some final, maybe 5 or 6 final recommendations, and then I'll be happy to take any questions, thoughts, or reactions as we conclude. So here's one of the most important things we can do is to learn more about racial microaggressions, because the more we learn, the less likely we're going to be, will be to microaggress someone, and the more effective we're going to be in responding to them. So this workshop is as much about recognizing our own microaggressions, but also building our capacity to actually respond to them in an effective way. Second, once we understand what racial microaggressions are and how easy they are to commit and how damaging they can be, we have to make sure we have community norms, right? We have to be clear about what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And we have to model these norms on a consistent basis, and we have to call out those who violate these norms. So these norms can in many ways be your saving grace. Something that you can reference when you're actually addressing this, right? So sometimes it's a value statement that the institution has. It could be, a value statement that's posted. I've seen, different departments post statements on the wall, things like that. And so these norms can be really critical. It's hard to emphasize values and norms that you haven't established. Next, we have to recognize that we live in a racially salient society, especially right now, when we think about the current political climate, which tends to be very anti-immigrant and anti-minority. And so we have to recognize that racial microaggressions are going to be more present now than perhaps they have been before. This is the reality. It's just the situation that we're living in, and we just have to be mindful and more vigilant about it. Next, we have to gain a greater sense of self and be reflective. The more we learn about ourselves and make our implicit biases more transparent, the more successful we'll be in avoiding and addressing microaggressions. So I would encourage everyone to go online and take the implicit association test. It's the IAT. You can Google Project Implicit, and there's like a good dozen or so different tests that you can take that can kind of help you identify, where are some areas in which you might have some implicit bias. And that'll give you some ideas of things you need to be more mindful of and maybe engage in a little bit more professional development to address it. We want to convey authentic care and high expectations. When this is our default, when we're consistent in, letting our students know we care about them and we expect them to achieve at the highest level, then this kind of becomes our default. It becomes our system one thinking. And so we really need to be intentional in practicing that on a consistent basis. We need to address opportunities for meaningful cross-racial interaction. Put ourselves in situations where we engage with people who are different from us, racially different from us. It's not helpful just from a microaggression standpoint, but it also helps us grow and mature as people. It helps us be better educators. And our society is becoming increasingly diverse and multicultural. And so this is a really important life skill that we all need to have. And then the last one is we have to take ownership of our mistakes. We're all gonna screw up at times. And when that happens, we shouldn't avoid it. We shouldn't be defensive. You know, we need to be humble and accept personal accountability for what we've done. And that concludes the content of the presentation. And I'd be happy to spend a few minutes taking any questions, thoughts, comments, concerns, feedback, whatever it is you have to share. Thank you. And you can unmute yourself and go ahead and speak when you feel comfortable doing it.
Okay, so I have one. Now,
Yep.
this example may not really be as common, but I was thinking just some examples. So what about if there was a racial microaggression between two youth, and you being the educator in this situation? How do you go about that?
Between two youth, meaning like, you know, two students at the campus?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, well, I think that's, you know, I think the same rules apply. So when we think about the Raven, right, we have a responsibility and an obligation to redirect the conversation, ask questions, right, emphasize our own thoughts and feelings, clarify our values, and offer next steps. And so I think a big part of this is these are teachable moments for our students. So we always want to address it with, you know, we want to take it seriously, but we also want to, you know, address it in a compassionate and constructive way. I think that's important. So we never want to do anything that's going to alienate a student, make them feel like they don't belong or that they're no longer valued in that space. But we do have a responsibility to do something, right? We can't sit back and do nothing is the key there.
I have a question.
Yes.
So what's the biggest, okay, first question, what's the biggest challenge when it comes to dealing with microaggression in terms of sensitization to educators and all, and to students more so? Also, how huge is a campaign to equip educators to handle microaggression? Because all the classes I've been to here in America, I have experienced it, and mostly educators do not know how to deal with that. They deal with that either when it's too late or never, and that's the case for many other people I've spoken to in not just my school, but in other schools and in different states.
Yeah, well, first of all, let me take your first question. I think the biggest challenge is a lack of awareness and a lack of understanding. I think most people kind of assume that microaggressions are not, either they don't even recognize a microaggression when it happens, or if they do, they don't really think it's a big deal. Or they say, that's one little statement, or the student was joking, not a big deal. I'm not going to focus on that. I'm going to focus on, you know, content and learning. And what we have to recognize as educators is that microaggressions are a big deal, because it's not just the one microaggression that you observe, but you got to think about, you know, particularly for students of color, that they are consistently experiencing microaggressions like on a daily basis. And so the cumulative effect of them can be incredibly detrimental. They can create a sense of not belonging, a sense of not being valued, a sense of having their identities threatened. So these are all important things, but I'll also say this, I understand why people don't address them, because how often do we get any training on microaggressions? I mean, when I think about graduate, you know, I mean, I have 2 graduate degrees, and I didn't learn anything about microaggressions, not one thing. Didn't read one single article, didn't have one single lecture, not one single conversation about it as a graduate student. And so if I haven't, had any real training, then how can I be effective in recognizing it and addressing them? Or if I do address them, if I do recognize them, and I decide to do something, then I approach it in a way that's not very effective. And I think that's why, you know, when I work with campuses, on this content, a big part of it is raising awareness and understanding that this is a real phenomenon and it has some real implications for students' success. And that's why we spend time. That's why you've spent an hour plus doing this, because it's a lot of your time. Your time is very valuable, but this content is valuable too in building our capacity to be equity-minded educators. Any other?
I have another question.
Yes.
Or a statement question. So talk about the responsibility of minorities not
to use microaggressions.
not being responsible for making people comfortable about recognizing, like, the biases or, prejudice or what may, like, it's not Black people's responsibility to make people comfortable and keep the status quo. You know what I'm saying? That, like, the burden has been on Black people to make, people okay, people to make people feel okay without challenging what we can perceive as wrong or we know that is wrong.
Yeah, so let me, I think I understand what you're asking. Let me give you an example. I am often on campus at night, right? I teach graduate courses, so I have classes that end at 10 p.m. And I've taught at night my entire career. And so I find myself, if I'm leaving my office at night, and obviously I identify as a man of color, and I see a woman, right, particularly a Caucasian woman, if I find myself in, approaching, like, I already know, I recognize assumption of criminality. So I make sure what I find myself doing is doing things to disarm her and to let her know that, hey, I'm not going to hurt you. I'm not going to harm you. Whether that means crossing the street, right? If we're approaching on the sidewalk, or maybe I'll grab my phone and, pretend I'm having a phone conversation and I'm preoccupied. And I think, I think as a person of color, you kind of do that because in many ways it's a coping strategy, but it's also a survival strategy because you don't want to be accused of doing something, right? You don't want to be wrongly accused. But also, when you have to do that all the time, it could be humiliating, it could be degrading, and it could the emotional cost can be, pretty taxing. And so, part of what we say, and part of what I hear you're saying, Ginger, is, is that, do we have a responsibility to continue doing that? Why do we do that? Well, I'm not here to tell people what they should and shouldn't do. I mean, I think you have to do what allows you to, to be comfortable. But I think, I am here to say that it's, it takes an emotional toll that most people don't recognize. And so part of the second part of this response is that we need our colleagues, we need our white colleagues to be allies, to, when microaggressions come up, it shouldn't always be the person of color who has to address them or who bears the burden of saying something, right? And then the last point, I'll say this, so we also have to be mindful of this. While people of color tend to be on the receiving end of microaggressions, people of color can microaggress as well. And we have to, we have a responsibility of building our capacity to not do what we don't want done to us as well, is what I would say. But yeah, it's layered, it's complex. Yeah, and there's a lot that we do unconsciously that we probably don't even recognize anymore because we're so accustomed to doing it, right? It kind of goes back to So I remember being a teenager, being, you know, maybe 13, 14 years old, and my parents would say, okay, like, listen, Frank, you're a young black man, and this is what society perceives of you. This is what you do, this is what you don't do, right? If you're approached by the police, make sure you do these things. Like you're kind of given a little bit of a rule book, a playbook on how to be a person of color in society and not put yourself in jeopardy. And it does, I mean, the burden of that and years of that, yeah, I mean, it's taxing, it's frustrating in many ways.
I was reading an article a couple of weeks ago, and I think they called it the emotional labor that we put out.
Yeah. There's a guy named William Smith. I would encourage everybody to take a look at this. His name is William Smith. He's a professor at the University of Utah. And he writes about this phenomenon called racial battle fatigue. And basically what he says is that there are physiological and psychological consequences for people of color who are consistently find themselves in chronically racist spaces. So he talks about, you know, depression, anxiety, you know, headaches, trouble sleeping. So all these things, like these physical symptoms that maybe, you know, experience on a regular basis, but that we don't ever make the connection between those things and being in a chronically racist environment. And so, you know, it's a fascinating body of work I would encourage everyone to check out.
Thanks.
Yep. Probably got time for one more before we wrap.
I have a question.
Yes, go for it.
I know you've done most of your studies like within the schools, but how could that actually like transition into like the professional atmosphere? You know, like I've seen to where like minority, you've been in meetings and things of that nature, and sometimes you may raise a question, or some of us may feel like a little bit less likely to ask a question or to raise a point or issue because someone in times may have tried to minimize, you know, what you're trying to say, or if you do say something, you know, they want to try to claim you as maybe being like they don't want to say anything to you. You may be hostile, or you know, they just rather not deal with anything of what you have to say or your contribution. So how do you do that without, or a person approach that without, you know, getting mad or getting attitude, or just wanted to, you know, step to that person, you know, the wrong way, and then they want to go to the boss and say, hey, you know, this person needs to be, you know, talked to or dealt with, because I don't feel, you know, I feel some kind of way about the issue.
Well, that's a good question. Let me respond. So I like to respond to these questions with like examples of from my personal experience, because I think it helps to bring a certain level of clarity and authenticity to the content. So there was a time we had a faculty meeting at my, you know, at a place where I worked, and you had a colleague who said something that I didn't appreciate. I responded. I didn't, you know, I wasn't hostile. I wasn't, you know, I didn't get crazy or anything like that, but I did express some dissatisfaction with what she shared. And the response was, at least the response in the meeting, you know, things got, you know, we sort of went back and forth, and eventually, you know, it subsided. But the colleague went to the dean of the college and accused me of being aggressive. Being aggressive. Now, you know, that's a trigger word, you know, for me, because it's right in line with, you know, it's the angry black man, you know, who's attacking. No, she said I attacked her. That's what she said. I attacked her in a meeting, in a faculty meeting. That was the response. And I got to be honest, it kind of, for about, you know, a year, it really I mean, I didn't want to say anything. I didn't feel comfortable going to the meetings. And when I went, I didn't want to say anything because, you know, the career implications of that can be devastating, right? And so I had to get to a point where I kind of recognized what it was. I had to not personalize it. I had to sort of recognize that it wasn't about me specifically, right? That I just happened to be the person who triggered something, right? Triggered this response. But I also had to make sure that I engaged in some self-care as well, that I didn't internalize it, that I had colleagues, I had healthy outlets to address it, you know, talk with colleagues, whatever it may be. And so I think you have to recognize that, yeah, I mean, that, you know, you're going to be the angry, at times you're going to be, in your case specifically, the angry Black man. That's how you're going to be perceived. And there's not a whole lot you can do about that. But you do have control over how you respond. And what you don't want to do is make someone else's issue, you know, your issue. And you don't want it to impact your performance, your engagement, and, you know, your advocacy or whatever it is that you're responsible for doing. And if it's a relationship you value, if this is a colleague and it's a relationship you value and a relationship that's important to you, then maybe you take the time to address it and say, hey, you know, Frank, man, I don't know what happened in that meeting. I think, you know, you misunderstood where I was coming from. You know, right? You make it right if it's a relationship that you think would be important. But I think, again, in the end, you have your own issues. You can't like make someone else's issue your issue either. As long as you're putting yourself in situations where, you know, you're behaving like a professional, you know, and there's other people there who can vouch for you. That's what would be important in that regard. But you really don't want it to stop you from being who you are as a person and impacting what you do as an educator.
Thank you.
Yep. All right. Well, with that, we're gonna wrap it up. Thank you again for spending some time with me today. I know you have a lot to do. I know some of you are homeschooling kids as we speak. You're caring for family members. You got your own work, schoolwork, work at the college. So I really do appreciate you taking some time to spend with me. I hope you found it useful and insightful. And I want to wish you all the end of a very challenging semester. And, you know, wishing that everyone is safe and healthy and that your loved ones are safe and healthy as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
See you, Ms. Gendra.
Take care.
Have a good day.